Hi, I'm Brandon Bowers, pastor of New Life Church, located in Locust, North Carolina. And I wanted to say thanks for stopping by and checking out our YouTube channel. I hope that today's message is both encouraging and challenging to you and your walk with Christ. If you're in our area sometime, we would love to have you come check out one of our services, each and every Sunday at 8:45, 10:15, and 11:45. We'd love to have you come out. And I hope that you enjoy today's message.
That in everything, Jesus might have the supremacy. That seems to be the theme of Paul's letter to the Colossians. We've been looking at this small book for now about 6 weeks. And the message to us has been, when Jesus has the supremacy, the total domination, the preeminence, however you want to word it, when He is your primary focus, everything changes. Everything about life, everything about your relationships, everything about Christian liberty, everything about what we're going to talk about today, our careers, our work life, everything changes, takes on new life, and is raised to a higher level, what we are calling a colossal level. So if you got your Bibles, tablets, phones, whatever it is that you're going to use to follow along this morning, go ahead and find Colossians chapter 3. We're going to be looking at the last few verses of this chapter and the first verse of Colossians chapter 4. And you might be thinking, gosh, we've spent all this time in chapter 3, like the last 2 or 3 weeks. We're only going to have one verse out of chapter 4 and then call it quits. Well, this just seems to be where our series has us stopping. It's not that there's not plenty of truth in chapter 4 or anything like that. It just happens to be the way it worked out. And Paul has some very specific things this morning. After talking about how to have a colossal family, a lifestyle, how to have colossal relationships, he turns his attention here at the end of this chapter to what we might call our work life. The secular life, the corporate life. And he wants us to see that even our career can be experienced and lived at a colossal level. That, going to work, doing whatever it is that you do, it can be enjoyable. It can be fulfilling if Christ has the supremacy. But see, just like with a lot of areas in life, we've believed the lie that if my job were different, if I worked for a different company, if I worked around different people, or say if you're the owner of the company, if I had better employees, then things would be better. Or my experience here would be better, it'd be more enjoyable and more fulfilling. But the truth is, that's probably not the case. Rarely is that the case. What Paul wants us to remember is that when Christ has the supremacy, it doesn't really matter what the circumstances are. We can live and experience life, whatever it is, at a colossal level, because everything changes. Everything takes on a new look. And we can have the same old crappy job as we had before, but when Christ is at the forefront, when He has total domination in our life, then we can actually enjoy that job, because we now have a new perspective. We now have a new motivation for doing that job, because we know that in doing it, what we're going to see, Paul tells us, is that we're reflecting Christ and His lordship in our life. But now most of you in here are probably employees. You work for someone, you work for a company. Some of you may be employers. Maybe you have your own business, or you're a manager, a foreman, or a supervisor. And so we're going to find that Paul has some very direct things to say to each group on how to have a colossal career. But there are others that you're in a different situation. Maybe you're retired, or you're a stay-at-home mom, or even a stay-at-home dad. There's a few of those. You may be a self-employed person with no employees. You work by yourself and for yourself most all the time. Or maybe you're a full-time volunteer. We have people that come into our church and volunteer throughout the week, and that's just sort of the way they live their life. They volunteer. Maybe it's for us or for somebody else. I believe you're going to be able to find it very easy to apply what Paul has to say here in Colossians chapter 3 about our working lives. And so let's just jump in and see what Paul has to say about landing the colossal career. Chapter 3, verse 22. He says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it, not only when their eye is on you and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it is the Lord Christ that you're serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, for there's no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. So before we get too far into this, we need to address the elephant in the room, and that is that Paul calls out specifically slaves and masters. You know, two terms that are somewhat unfamiliar to us, and so we're wondering, well, how is this going to be relevant to me, the modern day worker, the modern day employee or employer? And I think we're going to easily see the relevance. All we need to do is just build a little cultural bridge. Unlike today, where most workers get compensated and work for a wage or a salary, and that type of worker makes up pretty much all of the workforce, in ancient times, especially in the days of the Roman Empire, which is when the book of Colossians would have been written, slavery and servitude still made up a large percentage of the workforce. People that weren't necessarily working for money, but for other means of compensation. But here's the thing, we need to know a little bit about slavery, because when we first hear that word, you know, for us, Westerners, especially living in the South, when we hear the term slavery, we immediately think of, you know, images of pre-Civil War South here in the U.S. We think about African American people who were taken advantage of, who suffered degradation and brutality, mainly at the hands of predominantly white slave owners. And while there are many similarities between what we might consider modern day slavery and ancient times slavery, they're also very different as well. You see, back then, a slave may have been someone who was a foreign captive of war. And so there's very little similarity between what it was then and what we've learned it being, you know, in the history of our country. Because those people, those slaves, those captives would have had it much worse off than anyone or anything anybody experienced here. But the similarities come in when some of those who were of the ancient times really had some decent benefits and were actually cared for, may have even had it better off than pre-Civil War slaves, because they could have even owned property. They may have been even seen as valued members of the family that they were serving. They had certain rights. They may have managed entire estates. And speaking of the Jewish law, the Mosaic law, the law that governed God's people, he strictly forbid his people to mistreat slaves, to mistreat those who were in their service, to treat them with respect and do right by them. It's just that term. When we hear and we think of and we see that term slave, it just rubs us wrong. But the thing is, we need to sort of broaden our mind and our understanding of this word this morning, because in the Hebrew Old Testament, the Greek New Testament, many times what we're interpreting as slave could better be interpreted as servant or a bondservant. Still talks and is referring to somebody who is in the service of another, but it might be a voluntary thing. It might be that they're in the service of another because they need to pay off a debt. Or it might be that they're in the service of someone else because it's their only means by which to escape poverty, to survive. It's life or death for them. Or it could be involuntary. You know, a prisoner of war. It's the crime for some, or the punishment for some criminal act. It might be that they were born into servitude. Their parents and their parents before them were servants. And that's just sort of life for them. They're born into that. No matter the case, what we will see is that many of the jobs they performed would be very similar to jobs the modern worker would perform. And as long as we, in our understanding of what we're reading and talking about today, as long as we make room for the differences between slaves and servants then, and masters then, and employers and employees now, we'll be able to make the connection. We'll be able to see what Paul's trying to get across and help us see and experience work and careers on a colossal level. And so what I found as I was studying through this is Paul gives two instructions. One to the slaves, the servants, or the employees, and then he turns his attention to the masters, to the managers, to the employers. And so to the slaves, to the employees, he says each employee, and I'm going to give them both to you right up front, each employee should work for their employer with integrity and with intensity. If you want to experience a colossal career, then let that be your motivation. Let that be your focus. I'm going to work with integrity, and I'm going to work with intensity. I'm going to give my best. Look back at verse 22. He starts off by saying, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart, with integrity and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart, with intensity, as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, because it is the Lord Christ you're serving. And anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, for there is no favoritism." Now, I didn't include it particularly in the message points, but Paul begins with a very straightforward command for the worker, for the slave in his instance. And it may not have been well received in the beginning. It's not something that they really wanted to hear. But the command is simply, servants or employees, do your job. Just do it. Yeah, but you don't understand. They're not being fair, and I'm not getting paid as much. Do your job. Fulfill your obligations. Take care of your responsibilities. Just do that. And so many of the slaves in this day, the servants, wouldn't have been very happy to hear this because, they're hoping for something more. Keep in mind that Paul is talking to servants and employees who profess Christ as their Savior. The entire book of Colossians, we need to remember, he's writing to believers, not unbelievers. And so maybe these believing servants are hoping to hear from Paul, "Oh, you can go ahead and leave. You can abandon your master because you shouldn't be under that. You shouldn't have to listen and work for somebody like that." That's what they're hoping for. Or maybe they're hoping to hear from him to give a command to the master saying, "You need to release your servants. If they have any debt, you just need to clear it. Just let them go. Live life, free them." But that's not what Paul says, does he? He says to the believing servant, to the believing employee, do your job. If you want to show that Christ is supreme in your life, then serve and obey. Do what you're supposed to do. And for the modern day worker, it's like he's telling us, instead of being resentful and resisting our employer and his or her expectations of us, we should faithfully dispense our duties. Just do what we're supposed to do, what we were hired to do, and do it with excellence. And so then he moves on to the more specific instructions. Do your work with integrity and with intensity. As I was getting ready for this message, I was just reading and flipping through different books and resources and things. I ran across this one article that talked about the employees of one particular factory were given the opportunity to suggest to the company how they could improve morale, improve working conditions. So the company set out the suggestion box, and my suggestion is don't ever do that because all you're going to get is just negative comments. But anyway, they did. And the first comment that came in was something like, "We want all of the managers and the foremen and supervisors to stop wearing rubber-heeled shoes." It's like, why would they even want that? Well, it's obvious because they wanted to slack off and wanted to be able to hear when the supervisor, when the boss is coming, so they know, get back to work. Because it's true. The old saying is, nobody goes home before his shift is over unless the boss goes home early. Then you're free to do whatever you want to do. You're free to leave when you want to leave. That's the mentality. That's sort of the attitude in today's workforce. It's plagued with this sense of entitlement. Like you should be able to get away with as much as you can, slack off as often as you can, but get paid for it the most that you can. That's the mentality. That's the way many people approach their work life. But Paul says, a colossal career isn't achieved that way. It isn't achieved by taking advantage of your employer, trying to get a lot for giving a little, or for slacking off, or for only doing what you're supposed to do when the boss is around or when he or she is watching. No, he says integrity, and working with integrity means that you're going to do your job the way it's supposed to be done, when it's supposed to be done, whether anybody's watching or not. That's what it means to work with integrity. In fact, he says that we should want to do our work that way. We should want to work with integrity, even if the boss isn't around, because of our reverence for God. Our reverence and our acknowledgement of the presence of God. Literally translated, what Paul is saying here is that the thought of slacking off, the thought of doing a subpar job should be put to flight by our fear. That's what reverence means, our fear of God and our recognition of His presence everywhere all the time. God's eyes is on us whether the boss is around or not. He knows what's going on. And that should spur us to work with integrity. But He not only directs us to do that, but He also says you need to work with intensity. In other words, if you're going to work, then work hard. Give it 100% every single time, every single day. That's what he meant there in verse 23 when Paul writes, whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart. Work at it with all of your heart. That means to work from the soul. One translation says that whatever your task is, put yourself into it. Like throw yourself into your work. Whatever you're doing, work at it with enthusiasm. You see, for the follower of Jesus, this is a call to work for excellence, not for what's just enough. To give ourselves fully. And we shouldn't stop short and limit this challenge simply to the workplace. Like it begins and ends when we clock in and clock out. Paul said, whatever you do, whether you're at work, whether you're at school, whether you're at church, whether it's in your hobby, whether it's at home, whatever you do, you see, we honor God the best, and we reflect that Christ is supreme in our life when whatever we're doing, we do it with integrity and we do it with intensity. And so that's Paul's two directives to every employee, those who are working or serving someone else. Work with integrity and intensity. It'll raise the level of your work and your career experience. But then he turns his attention to those who are employers, those who, in essence, call the shots, the managers, the supervisors, and the foremen. And he says that every employer, every master should provide their employees with two things, with equity and equality. With equity and equality. Verse 1 of chapter 4 says, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and what's fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. Provide what's right and what's fair. Equity and equality. Two things that are related. They have a lot of things in common. Justice, what's right, and fairness. And you think, why would Paul mention those two things specifically? He could have called out many, many responsibilities of the employer to the employee. But why those two things? Why what is equitable and what is the equality thing? What's fair? Well, keep in mind, he's writing to believers. And in this particular verse, he's speaking directly to believers who are masters, who are employers, who are managers. They have influence over those who are serving and working for them, all of which may not be believers, right? If you're an employer, it doesn't, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean everybody that works for you is. So just think about it. You have a lot of influence over those lives that work for you. So the Christian employer, if he has this kind of influence, what kind of spiritual impact is he or she going to have if he or she treats his employees harshly, abusively, takes advantage of them, pushes them to unreasonable levels, denies them certain essential benefits? Is that employer then going to have a positive or a negative impact for Christ in the life of that employee? Well, it's probably not going to be very good, is it? But if if he or she wants to represent Christ and reflect that Christ is supreme in their life, then treating their employees with equity, with what's right, giving them what is due them, and fairly, treating them fairly, that's going to reflect Christ, that Christ rules and reigns in their own heart and in their own life because they're doing right by other people. You see, in the Roman system, rarely would have any servant or any slave had any legal recourse to being treated unfairly. It's just sort of the way it was. Because even those who were well treated, who were educated, who may have owned property, who managed estates, they were still, if they were in the service of someone else, were still in many ways considered the property of the master. They were limited. And so if they were treated unfairly, if they were treated harshly, they realized it wasn't anything that they could do about it. They could complain about it, but nobody was listening. But what Paul wants us to see is that a modern day employer is God's vessel to provide for the needs of that employee. Like those people that work for you, those people that help you, God has entrusted them to you. He's using you to meet their needs. And in many ways, their livelihood depends on you and how you allow God to work through you to meet their needs. And so even if the way you treat them and the way you provide for them is what is legal, is it really what's right? Is it really just? Is it what's fair? Is it equitable? Because at the end of the day, what Paul wants us to keep in mind is that we will answer for the way we treat those who work for us. Whether you're the business owner or not, maybe you're a manager or a supervisor and you have just a few employees under you. You'll stand an account before God of how you treat those people and how you work for them and on their behalf. Because he said, you have a master in heaven. You know, one day you will stand and answer according to what he judges is fair and right, not by what this world says is legal. So we need to keep that in mind. It'll elevate and raise the entire morale of the workplace and our experience in our careers. But, you know, does that mean that every single person who works for you has to be paid the same, has to be provided with the same benefits, no matter what their work level, their work is, no matter their skill level, no matter their experience or tenure? Well, no. I mean, we know there are differences. There are differences in skills, and there's different pay levels for people who have tenure and bring certain things to the table. We understand that. Politicians don't, but we do. Like real working people understand that. Like there is a difference between, you know, someone who flips burgers at McDonald's, not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's a difference between that and someone who's working an oil rig in North Dakota. Like there's a different compensation package and benefits that go along with those things. And that's what's right and that's what's fair. So equity, what's equitable and what's fair is usually judged upon case by case by case. And that's okay. Because, see, even in your workplace, there are probably differences between individuals, like what you do and what someone else does, and their experience versus your experience, their skills versus your skills, and y'all may be paid at a different level. Y'all may receive different benefits, and that's okay. The governing principle here for everyone is simply this, that employees, especially those who are working for professing Christian employers, should always be treated with respect, never oppressed, never exploited and taken advantage of, and never defrauded, but always treated with fairness and with justice, be done right by them. And see, when we start thinking about, you know, how we can elevate our lives and our relationships, our marriages, our homes, our lifestyle, our work experience, and as I've outlined through the entire book of Colossians, you can do this, you can do that. If you were to deliver this to your average citizen who has no real thought or perceives no need for God and has no understanding of the blessing of Christ's supremacy in their life, This stuff sounds crazy. It's absurd. Why would I want to work for an employer with integrity and with intensity when, I don't think they pay me what I deserve? Or when I think I ought to get a few more weeks or days of vacation? Or when the work environment is not completely up to par, to standard, why should I do that? Or why should I treat my workers with equity and equality when, man, they're a bunch of slack-offs? They don't work as many hours as I do. They don't carry the stress and the workload that I do. See, it sounds absurd. But Paul says this is the way to a colossal life. Living life, experiencing life on a colossal level. Everybody out there will say, if you want to get the most out of people, you want to get the most out of relationships, you want to get the most out of your employer and your employees, you want to get the most out of your spouse, then you do what's best for you. You look after number one. And if that means that you have to take advantage of them, if that means you have to manipulate them, if that means that you have to hold grudges and get revenge and stay angry, you just do what's best for you. If it means you move the boundaries of what's moral or what's ethical, don't worry about that, because that's how you get ahead. But Paul's been teaching us that the Word of God tells us something extremely different. And in one little short letter to believers in Colossae, way back in the 1st century A.D., Paul reveals that when you have a relationship with Christ, and when you give Him absolute and total supremacy in your life, then everything in life can be raised and experienced on a colossal level. A level that will provide true, deep, and eternal satisfaction. So that's really going to end like our look at the book of Colossians. And we got to remember, it all started Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, so that in everything Jesus might have the supremacy.